Welcome to MindStand Pod, a series exploring workplaces and diving into cultures that make them tick. Each of our seasons will dive into unique factors of business, provide great stories from leaders in human capital, and offer helpful insights you can use today to impact your company.
Hello, everyone. We have Loehr. Happy Monday. It's been a long weekend, hopefully even longer last week. How are you?
I am great. It has been a long weekend and we're moving into the end of the year and starting a new year. So that's exciting.
Yes. I know for so many people, the end of the year is the most exciting time. They're seeing those vacation days pack up, so they're ready to go, whether it's to Spain or just, to California. But for some people, I can see definitely seeing the end of the year be a crunch. How are we working? How are we hitting deadlines? So we can definitely just use this moment for those to practice mindfulness, practice ways that you can feel more comfortable and more present, because the next year is coming, but you always want to prioritize yourself and your mental health. So we have Loehr here, an amazing woman in the DEI space. I'd love to start off by asking, who are you?
I am the youngest of 8 kids. I am a mother. I am a wife. I am a daughter. I am someone who is passionate, Michael, about equity and inclusion. I currently live in the Washington, D.C. area, but have spent 12 years living in East Africa and running safari companies there, and have spent a lot of time working in Europe. So that's just a small snippet of who I am.
Exciting. Someone who's learned of the world, been able to travel across the world. Me being West African, specifically Nigerian, I definitely resonate. Christmas time around now is beautiful, so beautiful. So bringing you here to the nation's capital, to the DMV, would love to learn what you're working on.
So I'm with an organization, and what we always say is that we are data geeks who happen to focus it on improving organizations and specifically the talent. So how do we engage talent? How do we get people excited to do the work that they're doing, whatever that work may be? So at a high level, that's what I'm always doing, whether it's through coaching, whether it's through partnerships, whether it's through diversity, equity, and inclusion, whether it's finding some great new way to train someone through, maybe it's virtual like this, maybe it's live in person, but I wake up always thinking about how can we get people to show up fully, to get organizations to embrace whoever is showing up fully, and to create whatever needs to be created for that organization.
Speaking to a fellow data geek. I'd love to know, we've seen, especially over the past 15, 20 years, just this word data-driven decisions. Companies, whether it's from a CFO perspective down to the people side, how can you collect data and measure it so that things don't, bad processes don't continue, good processes are highlighted? Has that been a journey? Would love to learn more about your org and, how you found data to be the key in building people to be more connected.
It's definitely been a journey. I'd say if there's a few key words for the past 2 years or so, one is absolutely DEI, or diversity and inclusion, and the other is data. And what I think you and I are doing now is starting to marry the two. Just to give you an example, not so much of the DEI space, but leadership development programs or management development programs, right? I'm sure people have been part of organizations where the organization says, hey, we've got this great program, we want you to be part of it. And then they call us and they say, can you create it? And we say, yes, we can create it. Tell us about the people who'll be in it. And they'll be saying, well, we've got Thomasina. I'm like, great. So what was the criteria for Thomasina? I don't know. Thomasina is just a great person. I want Thomasina to benefit from this. And I'm like, okay, well, who else is going to be in it? Well, Avi's going to be in it. Okay, what was the criteria for Avi? Oh, I just think Avi's going to be really successful, so I want Avi to be in it. And so that's my first clue of, I'm so glad you're passionate about developing your team. And let's take a step backwards. First of all, what are we trying to measure in this program? What do we want the outcome to be? And second of all, how do we choose people to be in the program? Because there is so much bias that shows up. often unconscious, as we start to select people for a new task, for a committee, for a training program, that kind of thing. So that's an example of where generally data is a little lax when it comes to the talent space, and how we can really start to tighten it up so that everybody understands what the criteria is and everybody has been chosen because of the criteria.
Absolutely. You can't afford to not be intentional when you're gathering data on people experience and people management. A story I love sharing with people is how we've met with a chief people officer at a international, when you search something up, you're probably using that website. And they said, you know, we needed to understand the employee experience. We want to engage better with our employees, especially over the year we've had, from a racial and religious standpoint. But after completing or filling out these employee surveys, we had, Black employees from Brazil, Los Angeles, New York, reply all. I don't want another email like this, especially when I'm in the midst of emotional turmoil. I'm in the midst of unpacking how I feel. When you're using data, that intentionalness of who and how you're gathering the data is so key. And I'm glad that's a huge focus within your organization.
Yeah, often the word I use is choice. It gives us choice. When we have the data and we have intentionality, that gives us choice, and we can respond to it appropriately. And whatever the organization decides is whatever they decide, rather than reacting because of something. It's like, no, we're going to get a landscape survey. We're going to figure out what's going on. We're going to hear voices. We're going to be intentional about the questions we ask in that survey. And then we're going to respond from choice.
Exciting. It's exciting. I'd love to know, I'm sure the viewers would love to know too, how long have you been in this position? How long have you started this journey? What's been the day-to-day over these past few years?
I have had a very unconventional career. I started off in hospitality, grew up in hospitality, restaurants and kitchens, went to hotel school, and then left that hotel school to go to culinary school, became a chef, and went back to hotel school to finish that degree. Ended up working in Texas at a corporate hotel, realized it was not for me. And that is when I moved to East Africa, and absolutely loved my time there. Spent 12 years building hotels, building safari companies. And the thing that really took me to where I am now is building talent, really realizing these people have a different kind of education. And it is absolutely my goal to create assistant general managers. And how do we do that? That's through what we call leadership development, management development. And at the time I was sitting in the coast, we call it the coast of Kenya near Mombasa, and I didn't have access to the internet. I didn't have access to all the things we've accessed. I'm like, how am I going to get this group of 10, 12 people to a place where they can run hotels on their own? And so I had to learn myself. And so those were my very early days in terms of leadership development. And those were also my very early days of seeing racism firsthand. Not that it is not in upstate New York where I grew up, but really seeing it overtly when people were talking about our staff. We had over 500 staff, and realizing that I could actually start to shift things when it comes to both topics. Sold all of that, moved back to the States, and moved to the Washington, D.C. area. And now really that's what I focus on. Again, could be different tools, could be through coaching, could be through training. Had my own company for a while, and then merged with this company in Alexandria outside of Washington, D.C., because they were the metrics people. And I really wanted to understand the metrics and how do we measure all of that kind of thing. Have had the opportunity to write some books along the way. I've also had the opportunity to do many keynotes and work with really interesting people. So it's been unconventional. It's been fabulous as well.
Amazing. That's so amazing. If we can we just get a short list of some of the books you've published, presentations people can see and view now?
Sure. So my two books, the first one is called A Manager's Guide to Coaching. And so that teaches busy managers how to coach. You don't have to be an external coach like I am, and you go into an organization. As a manager, as a leader, you want coaching skills to be able to have that retention, that engagement that we talked about. So that was my first book, teaching busy people how to coach. My second book is called Managing the Unmanageable. It's kind of a joke because many people say, I want that book, but can you give it to me in a bag so people don't see it, that I have it on my desk? But really talking about how to manage so-called difficult employees and what are some strategies for that. I also write a lot. I write a blog probably every week to 2 weeks, and so I have a lot of writing out there. In terms of presentations, really anything in leadership. Stress management is one of the most popular. And also I spend a lot of time looking at future trends. What can we expect in the future about our workforce? AI, I know that's your world, but also looking at things such as diversity, also looking at women in the workforce and kind of putting all the pieces together for organizational leaders of here's where we are right now. As of right now, we still are in COVID. And then in the future, this is what we think is going to happen. And so how do managers, leaders, supervisors put all that together to create that engagement and that retention?
So exciting. When we move, and as we are moving into the next year, these questions of how are we going to work together, what does the new workforce look like? But as you emphasized and you've written on, a lot of it relies on soft skills, being able to understand the empathy, being able to read between the lines of a Slack message or an email, to notice that, your employee, your coworker, they just are kind of reaching out for someone to relate, to be able to really empathize with, the current work status of today. So that's so exciting. Again, everyone listening, I highly encourage you to take some time to read and listen. I imagine there's Medium pages, ways that people can subscribe, but we'll include that in the links and descriptions of this video. So I'd love to know, and you've spent this time kind of on this planet, meeting and engaging with so many amazing people. We could talk for hours about hospitality in Africa, specifically West and East, because it's so beautiful. Beverly Hills is, one of 50 hotel chains in Nairobi or across the African hemisphere. I'd love to think about, and you can let us know, what is something you want to teach the world?
I want to teach the world how to listen with empathy. And that's two different skill sets. Listening is one skill set. Most people think it's not, but it actually is. And again, it goes back to your conversation about intentionality. Like, how do we just listen? And then listening with empathy. And there's two parts to empathy. The empathy is, can you even just listen and notice what's going on, the person in front of you or the room in front of you? And then can you put yourself in that person's shoes? And that is often very difficult for a lot of people. So people say, well, I heard them say that, but I don't understand. Like, well, did you put yourself in their shoes? What it is like to be an independent parent? What it is like to be perhaps two adults at home with two young kids in COVID? Like, do you understand what it's like? Because I think when we have more empathy, that then leads to more inclusion. It's like, oh, Anne's not being a jerk. Anne is going through a lot right now. And then let me find ways to include her. And I like to be really clear. People sometimes think, well, if I include people, then we're going to reduce the standards. No, we can have both at the same time. We can have inclusion, welcoming people, embracing different ways of seeing the world, different ways of seeing a problem and problem solving, and maintain standards at the same time. So I'd say if there is just one thing, it's how do we listen with empathy? And then from there, I think everything else will just move forward slowly.
It's beautiful. I'd love to think a little bit about as well, and this is a comment I've heard, and I've said this before, often that idea of lowering the bar, of kind of decreasing the standard, or at least the quality of work. The world's changing at a rapid pace. You're finding people of different walks of life, all willing to put more and more time into their craft. People are comfortable using social media. People are comfortable being behind the camera. It's up to you as a leader to help train and empathize with employees. If you're able to, understanding today's climate, train, really make people of all different walks of life feel onboarded and comfortable working, you're raising the bar. You're not lowering it. So I couldn't agree more with that idea of, again, how can you empathize and make that a strength of your organization? One thing I'd love to do, again, knowing how data and metrics are a really key component of how you work, what are some top of mind things that you carry out through on the day-to-day and vision of your organization?
So everything we do, DEI and metrics are woven into. So if it is, for example, a training program, say, oh, let's do a training program on DEI. Okay, great. Well, let's figure out the pre-survey, let's figure out the post-survey, and let's figure out what we're trying to measure. And then let's measure again 6 months later, did change occur? So we always say we bake it in. Most organizations think about it later, like, oh, shoot, do we have an evaluation for that training? Way too late, because if we don't, then that means you haven't thought about it. So starting with the design in terms of what is the data we want to measure, what is the outcome we want to measure. And most people say, but you can't measure this stuff. These are, as you use the word soft skills, I use the word non-technical skills. You can't measure. Absolutely, you can measure this. You can measure listening, you can measure trust, you can measure all types of things. And so first of all, what is it we want to measure? Then what is the metric we're going to use? Is it a survey? Is it some kind of biometric? Then baking it into the design, whatever the design is, it's a training, it's a program, it's some type of consultation, and then measuring it at the end. And people say, but I won't know until 6 months. Well, you might not know for 6 months, but I would rather we know in 6 months than the little happy loved the training checkbox, and we don't know if we actually made a difference.
Oh. Yeah, every goal should have that, what's the impact of it 6 months down the line? Every idea, if you're gonna invest money, if you're gonna invest time into efforts, how would you feel if, you invested time into your kids' sports team and they never told you, you worked on the trainings, you created the workshop, and they completely, kept you blind of what happened as a result? It's a very human, it's a very impactful thing to do, to show people that you want to know why and how your work is going to be appreciated in the office. So this is amazing. We've touched on so many different topics. We've reflected on kind of where the workspace is and how we're going to grow. At MindStand, one of our key goals is looking at the data that makes companies them, how they communicate with one another. We're excited to go into the next year with new partnerships, new integrations to start coaching companies of 20 down to 2,000 on what it means to be inclusive and active in today's cycle. I'm really glad, Anne, for you to be able to share your work and share how you're using data to create that intentionalness. That's a common theme we'll be sharing in these upcoming podcasts. I'd love to know, and this one might be a bit of a doozy, and who are 2 people you feel like would benefit from joining a conversation like this?
So I'm going to go in broad categories, Michael. I would say the first category is anybody who is managing even one person. So anybody who has a team of 1 all the way up to a team or team of managers. So I think just understanding this idea of listening, empathy, metrics, DEI, regardless of the sector, regardless of the organization. So I'd put that into one category. I would also put it into what I would call the organizational leaders. I know that organizational leaders feel a lot of pressure to hit whatever the results are, if you're a nonprofit, a for-profit, federal, local, state, government. And I know there's a lot of pressure. We've got to make sure things are working. And I would often encourage people to just slow down a little bit. They're like, I don't have time to slow down. I'm like, I'm not talking like an hour conversation. I'm taking 1 more minute, looking the person in the eye and asking them how they're doing and really listening to how they're doing. So I would put it in terms of anybody who's managing people, but then I would also say it starts at the top and really thinking about that leadership team. Are they modeling what I would call the leadership shadow, just the shadow behind you? And are they modeling that behavior for everybody else to see?
Excellent. Thank you, Anne. This has been an amazing conversation. We have so much more work to do going into the new year and beyond. DEI is a goal, DEI is measurable, and DEI is something you can get started on today. So I highly encourage you to connect with Anne and connect with MindStand as you begin this journey. Thank you all.